The lake is lower than anyone living beside it can remember, its shoreline pulled back across the stones like a curtain revealing a floor that should have remained hidden. Wind moves over the water of ancient Lake Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, but the world around it is not the warm biblical landscape later generations will imagine. It is a colder Earth, an Ice Age Earth, locked inside the long pressure of the last glacial maximum. Far to the north, ice sheets grind across continents. Sea levels are lower, deserts shift, forests shrink and return in broken patches. Rivers cut through exposed valleys that one day will drown beneath the sea. And here, on a fluctuating lakeshore in the Levant, people live in a camp beyond the imagination of history. This is not Sumer. There are no kings, no temples with baked brick walls, no scribes pressing signs into clay, no city gates, no accounts of grain and sheep, no names preserved by writing. Uruk is still more than 16,000 years away. The first city, the first bureaucracy, the first written lists of goods. All of that belongs to a future so distant that the people beside this Ice Age lake would have no reason to dream it. Yet the strange thing is that when archaeologists look closely at places like this, the clean old boundary between before civilization and civilization begins to blur. Not because there is a lost empire here, and not because the evidence proves some forgotten city existed in 20,000 BC. It does not. Scholars still debate how far we should go in describing these early lifeways as steps toward the later world, but something important is already happening. Human beings are beginning to make places matter in ways that outlast a single night's shelter. At Ahalo too, the traces are humble at first glance, the dark stains of ancient huts, hearths where fire once burned, stone tools, animal bones, fish remains, and the fragile ghosts of plants. But humble evidence can be more disturbing than grand ruins, because it escapes the old heroic picture of civilization arriving suddenly, as if cities were invented in one bright Mesopotamian morning. Here the story begins not with walls rising over a plain, but with people returning to a lakeshore, arranging their lives around water, fish, wild grains, seasonal movement, and memory. Their shelters are not monuments. They are brush huts. Their food is not stored in palace granaries. It is gathered, caught, processed, cooked, shared, and lost in ashes. Yet the site preserves a depth of daily detail that feels almost intimate. Plant remains that suggest the use of wild grasses, stones used for grinding, floors prepared for living, an evidence that people understood the landscape with an attention observers can only partly reconstruct. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the mystery here is not a single buried treasure, it is the long, quiet question of how humanity crossed the distance from camps like this to the first cities of southern Mesopotamia, and why that crossing took thousands upon thousands of years. Around 20,000 BC, the world does not yet have agriculture in the full sense. There are no domesticated wheat fields spreading across the Fertile Crescent, no managed herds in the way later villages will depend on them. People hunt, fish, gather, move, return, remember. Their knowledge is ecological rather than written. It lives in the hand, in the eye that knows when a plant is ready, where fish move, where fuel can be found, where stone can be struck cleanly, where wind makes a shelter fail. Nothing about this world is primitive in the sense of simple. It is technically demanding, socially alert, and unforgiving of careless assumptions. Civilization does not begin because people finally become intelligent. It begins after a long history of intelligence already at work. What survives in the record suggests that Ahalo too is part of this deeper human capacity for planning without cities, structure without states, and repeated placemaking without permanent architecture. Mud, water, and burial protect delicate remains that normally vanish. In most Paleolithic camps, plant fibers disappear, wooden objects rot, floor arrangements are erased, and the soft materials of life leave almost no trace. Stone survives and misleads us into thinking stone was the center of everything. But at places of unusual preservation, another world comes through reeds, grasses, wood, food plants, bedding, fish, and the ordinary textures of habitation. The deep past is not only made of blades and bones, it is also made of baskets, mats, cords, meals, sparks, smoke, and paths worn by returning feet. This matters because the title before Sumer can easily become a trap. Sumer is often treated as the beginning, and in many ways that is understandable. In southern Mesopotamia, by the late 4th millennium BC, settlements such as Uruk grow to a scale that feels unmistakably urban. Monumental buildings appear. Labour is organised. Goods are counted. Writing emerges from a world that needs to remember more than a human mind can hold unaided. But if we look only at the city, we miss the deeper sediments beneath it. Long before Sumer, people are experimenting with sedentism, ritual gathering, symbolic display, food processing, storage, architecture, and social memory. Not all of these experiments lead directly to cities. Some vanish, some remain local, some are abandoned when climate, resources, or social pressures change. No single explanation fully accounts for the later rise of farming and urban life, but the ingredients are older, scattered across many landscapes, and not always where older histories told us to look. The road to civilization is not a straight road. It is more like a braided river, splitting and rejoining across the Levant, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. In one place, people build huts beside a lake and process wild plants thousands of years before farming. In another, later people gather around stone enclosures carved with animals and human-like forms before settled village life looks fully established. Elsewhere, communities build towers, plaster floors, crowded houses, shrines, walls, and strange images that do not fit neatly into the old sequence of hunters first, farmers second, cities third. The evidence does not show a single sudden invention. It shows a long threshold. The Ice Age lakeshore is therefore not a prologue to be rushed through. Here, people are not waiting for history to begin. They're already making choices about food, shelter, cooperation, and place. They are already shaping a world of meaning, even if that meaning is mostly lost to us. The fires that once burned at Ahalo II do not illuminate a city, but they do illuminate something older than cities, the ability to return, to organize, to remember a landscape, and to make a temporary camp feel. For a time like the center of the world, and then the shoreline changes again. Water rises, mud seals what people leave behind. The camp disappears, not as a collapse, not as a ruin mourned by scribes, but as a quiet burial under lake sediments. For more than 20,000 years, the traces wait in darkness while the world warms. Glaciers retreat. Wild grains are gathered more intensively. Villages form. Ritual landscapes rise in stone. And far to the east and south, the low plains of Mesopotamia slowly prepare for their own transformation. By the time Sumer appears, this lakeshore has already been ancient for longer than Sumer is ancient to us. That is the scale of the mystery. The story of civilization may begin in cities, but the human story that made cities possible begins much earlier, in places where almost everything was meant to vanish. When the lake gives back a Harlow too, it does not give back a monument. It gives back a pause in human movement, a place where people stayed long enough for their lives to press themselves into the earth. The discovery is strange, partly because it is so ordinary. Archaeology often survives as the hard edge of the past stone, bone, fired clay, collapsed walls, carved pillars, things strong enough to resist rot and weather. But Oharlo too preserves something softer. It preserves the faint architecture of brush huts, the spread of hearths, the remains of meals, the placement of tools, and the botanical debris of people who never imagined their camp would become evidence in a debate about the deep origins of civilization. Their world is still Paleolithic, still built around hunting, fishing, gathering, and seasonal knowledge. But the site forces a more careful kind of attention. It is not a city, not a village in the later Neolithic sense, and not a farming settlement, yet it's also not a random scattering of wanderers passing through a landscape with no memory. It is a lived place, and that distinction matters. The camp lies on what was once the shore of Lake Kinneret, exposed only because modern water levels dropped enough to reveal buried remains. That accident is part of its power. For thousands of years, the lake and its sediments shielded fragile organic traces that open-air sites usually lose. Brush huts, plant remains, fish bones, charred seeds, and the marks of activity areas survive with unusual clarity. What emerges is a picture of people who understand their environment in layers. They know the lake as a source of fish and water birds. They know the surrounding land as a source of wild cereals, fruits, nuts, fuel, reeds, and animal prey. They know stone sources and tool forms. They know how to build shelter from plants that will bend, cover, insulate, and disappear. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a life that is far more organized than the old image of Ice Age people drifting from one emergency to the next. The huts are especially revealing. They are not massive structures, but they are planned enough to create interiors, floors, and repeated spaces of work and rest. A brush hut is not a palace wall, yet it contains a kind of intelligence that does not need grandeur to be impressive. Someone gathers branches and reeds. Someone chooses where the shelter should stand. Someone understands wind, slope, dampness, smoke, insects, and proximity to food. The hut is temporary in material, but not careless in design. Its floor becomes a map of activity where tools are made, where plants are processed, where people sit near warmth, where debris accumulates, where the work of living gathers into patterns. Archaeologists can read some of these patterns only faintly, and scholars still debate how confidently individual activities can be reconstructed from the preserved distributions. Still, the broader impression is difficult to ignore. These people are not merely occupying nature. They are arranging it. Food at Oharlo too deepens the mystery. The people here do not farm wheat or barley in the later domestic sense, yet wild cereals appear in ways that hint at systematic collection and processing. Grinding stones and plant residues point toward the preparation of wild grains long before the agricultural revolution becomes visible in the archaeological record. This does not mean agriculture begins here. That would be too simple, and the evidence does not support it. Wild plant processing is not the same thing as domestication, and collecting grains in abundance is not the same thing as sowing fields, generation after generation until the plants themselves change. but the difference should not blind us to the importance of the behaviour. Long before Sumerian scribes count barley rations on clay tablets, Ice Age families and groups are already gathering grasses, crushing seeds, cooking plant foods, and learning what the landscape can provide when watched closely enough. The distance between a wild seed crushed on a stone and a city's grain economy is immense. Yet the first act belongs to the same broad human capacity, the ability to see potential in small things. Fishing adds another layer. Lakeshore life offers a rhythm different from open steppe hunting. Fish can be seasonal, abundant, predictable in some conditions, and fragile in others. They require knowledge of water, movement, tools, timing, and processing. Fish bones from Ohalo 2 suggest that aquatic resources were not an afterthought. The lake was not merely scenery, it was a central part of survival. Perhaps one reason people could stay in the same place long enough to build structures and leave such concentrated evidence. Some researchers have suggested that the remains may even hint at methods of processing or preserving fish, though the details remain debated. If that interpretation is right, even cautiously, it would point toward another old route of later settled life, not farming, but storage, delay, and planning. A community that can preserve food can stretch time. It can turn a moment of abundance into a buffer against uncertainty. Civilization will later depend on this principle, but the principle itself is older than civilization. There is also a quiet surprise in the diversity of what people use. Ohalo 2 does not look like a desperate camp on the edge of starvation. The range of plant and animal remains suggests broad knowledge and flexible choice. That matters because older narratives often imagine major changes in prehistory as reactions to crisis alone. People farm because they are starving, settle because they have no choice, organize because chaos forces them to. Stress and climate surely matter, and no single explanation fully accounts for why some human groups later turn toward farming and village life. But abundance can also change behavior. A rich lakeshore can invite return. Predictable resources can allow longer stays. Longer stays can create heavier equipment, more defined spaces, more social memory, and eventually a stronger sense that a place is not merely used, but known. The deepest transformation may not be technological at all, it may be psychological and social. To return to a place is to begin building an invisible architecture of memory. A path becomes familiar, a shoreline becomes named, even if no name survives. A cluster of huts becomes the place where tools were repaired last season, where fish were dried, where firewood was stored, where certain plants could be found after rains. None of this requires writing. None of it leaves inscriptions. But it creates a relationship between people and landscape that later permanent settlements will intensify. Before walls, there are remembered places. Before cities, there are returns. This is why Ohalo 2 matters to a story that eventually reaches Sumer. It does not prove that civilization began in 20,000 BC. It proves something subtler and more useful. The foundations beneath civilization are far older than civilization itself. The habits of observation, processing, cooperation, shelter-making, symbolic attention, seasonal return, and landscape memory were already present in deep time. Later, in the warmer and more unstable centuries after the Ice Age, some of these habits will be reorganized under new pressures. Wild grain collection will become cultivation in some places. Seasonal camps will become more permanent villages in others. Communal gathering will take architectural form. Ritual and subsistence will intertwine in ways that archaeologists are still trying to understand. But at Ohalo 2, everything is still quiet. The people beside the lake do not stand at the gates of a future city. They stand in smoke and wind, among reeds, fish bones, stone blades, ground seeds, and shelters made from plants. They belong to a world that later ages will call prehistoric, as if the absence of writing means the absence of a story. Yet the story is there, pressed into floors and ashes, sealed under mud, waiting for the lake to fall, and when it finally appears again, it asks us to look at the beginning of civilization not as a sudden dawn, but as a long twilight filled with human skill, patience, and forgotten experiments. The most unsettling clue at Ohalo 2 is not the hut, or the hearth, or even the fish bones scattered through the old lakeshore deposits. It is the seed. A seed is small enough to be overlooked, and for most of human history it disappears without ceremony. It burns too completely, decays too quickly, or is carried away by water, insects, wind, and time. Yet when seeds survive, they have a way of changing the scale of a story. They make the past less abstract. They remind us that the road to civilization was not built first out of stone, but out of countless acts of noticing which grasses ripen first, which seeds can be gathered in quantity, which plants return after disturbance, which flavors can be made edible by grinding, roasting, soaking, or cooking, long before grain becomes tax, ration, debt, and political power in Mesopotamia. It is something held in the hand. At this Ice Age camp, plant remains suggest that people are not merely nibbling at the landscape. They're collecting a wide range of wild foods, including grasses that belong to the same broader world as the cereals that will later help feed villages and cities. This is not agriculture. It is important to say that clearly, because the temptation is strong to pull every early seed toward the future and call it a beginning. Domestication leaves biological signatures. A wild plant gathered by skilled foragers is not the same as a cultivated crop, changed by generations of human selection. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far to push the interpretation of early plant management at sites like Ohalo 2. But the very presence of grinding stones, charred plant remains, and organized living surfaces shows that plant foods are already part of a deep technical world. The human relationship with grain begins before fields. That single idea changes the older rhythm of the story. For a long time, the rise of civilization was often imagined as a kind of ladder. First came wandering hunters, then came farmers, then came villages, then came cities, writing, kings, and states. In that version, the great change begins when people finally plant seeds and stop moving. But the archaeological record is less obedient than that. It shows people experimenting with place, food, architecture, and symbolism in uneven ways. It shows communities who gather wild cereals long before farming, build remarkable communal structures before fully settled agricultural life, and maintain complex seasonal worlds that do not fit neatly into either nomadic or civilized. The ladder becomes a web, and in that web, Ohalo 2 is one of the older knots. The act of grinding wild grain is especially revealing because it changes the body's relationship to food. It is not like picking fruit and eating it immediately, though that too requires knowledge. Grinding takes effort. It requires tools that are heavy, durable, and often inconvenient to carry over long distances. It creates a reason to remain near a place, or to return to it, because the stone itself becomes part of the landscape of use. A grinding stone can outlast a season. It can be set down, used, abandoned, reused, moved, or remembered. The tool encourages a different pace of life, not necessarily permanent settlement, but a more anchored rhythm. The food is processed, transformed, made into something easier to cook, digest, share, and perhaps store for a short time. No single explanation fully accounts for how this eventually becomes agriculture, but this kind of repeated processing is one of the quiet habits from which later food economies grow. There is a lesser-known and remarkable possibility here. Some researchers have argued that the plant assemblage at Ohalo too includes signs of very early human disturbance around cereals, including plants that often thrive in disturbed ground. Such clues are delicate. They do not prove ploughed fields, and they should not be forced into a modern farming image. Yet they suggest that people and plants may already be influencing one another in subtle ways. A camp creates disturbance. People bring seeds in, spill them, burn them, discard them, trample the ground, clear patches, use fire, and return. Plants adapted to disturbed places can spread around human activity without anyone intentionally inventing farming. The first steps toward domestication may not have looked like a decision. They may have looked like repetition. This is where the story begins to feel almost uncanny. Human beings do not have to wake one morning and decide to create civilization. They only have to repeat useful behaviors in places where those behaviors have consequences. Return to the same lake shore. Gather the same grasses. Use the same stones. Clear the same patch. Burn the same refuse. Watch what grows afterward. Remember which places reward the effort. Across centuries, such acts can alter landscapes even without permanent villages. Across millennia, in different climates and different regions, they can become part of a much larger shift. The transformation is not sudden because human life is rarely sudden at archaeological scale. It accumulates. The climate surrounding these choices is unstable in the long view. The last glacial maximum grips the world, but it does not freeze human creativity. People adapt to cold, dryness, shifting shorelines, and altered plant zones. Later, as the world warms after the glacial peak, new opportunities and pressures will appear. The Levant and Anatolia will not simply become easier places to live. Some regions will grow richer in certain resources, while others become unpredictable. Climate change will rearrange the distribution of wild cereals, gazelle, woodland, water, and seasonal abundance. People will respond differently in different places. Some will keep moving across wide territories. Some will gather more often at favoured locations. Some will begin to intensify their use of plants and animals. What survives in the record suggests not one human answer to environmental change, but many. That is why the seed at Ohalo too should not be treated as a magic spark. It is more like a message from a long period of experimentation that usually leaves few messages at all. The later Neolithic world, with its villages, plastered floors, stored food, ancestor rituals, animal management, and eventually cultivated crops, does not emerge from emptiness. It emerges from older competencies already sharpened over tens of thousands of years. People know how to classify plants without botany. They know how to manage risk without mathematics. They know how to pass knowledge without writing. They know how to build shelters that vanish and social worlds that leave only a stain in the soil. The record is fragmentary, but it points to intelligence distributed through ordinary life. Far in the future, in southern Mesopotamia, grain will become something else. It will become counted. It will become administered. It will be measured in containers, sealed in storerooms, recorded with marks, allocated to workers, offered to gods, used to support specialists who do not grow their own food. Grain will help make the city possible, and the city will make grain political. But that future depends on a much older intimacy between people and plants. Before barley can become bureaucracy, before wheat can feed temple households, before clay tablets can remember harvests, someone has to know that a grass head is worth gathering at all. The lakeshore people of Ohalo too live on the far side of that long transformation. They do not see themselves as founders of anything. They are not rehearsing for Sumer. Their world is immediate wind, water, smoke, stone, seed, fish, firelight. But the evidence they leave behind makes the deep past feel less like a void before history and more like a patient workshop of human possibility. A seed falls into ash. A stone wears smooth under repeated motion. A shelter floor darkens with use. Then mud closes over everything. Thousands of years pass, and when the remains finally return to light, they do not announce the first civilization. They whisper something stranger. The habits that made civilization possible were already ancient before the first city had a name. As the Ice Age loosens its grip, the world does not become gentle all at once. It changes in pulses, reversals, wet centuries, dry centuries, sudden returns of cold, slow expansions of woodland, and shifting bands of grassland where animals move and plants ripen according to rhythms that people must learn again and again. The lake camp at Ohalo too belongs to a colder world, but the habits visible there do not disappear when the climate turns. They travel forward in altered form. The grinding of wild seeds, the return to favoured places, the knowledge of fish, reeds, stone, fuel, and seasonal abundance all become part of a wider human inheritance. Then, thousands of years later, across the Levant, the evidence begins to show something more sustained. People are no longer simply pausing in places that matter. In some regions, they begin to remain. This is the long threshold of the Epipaleolithic and the Natufian world, a time that refuses to behave like a simple prelude. It is still before farming in the full Neolithic sense. Domesticated cereals and animals have not yet remade daily life into the village economies of later millennia. Yet the old categories begin to strain. Some communities build more substantial houses, some bury their dead in repeated places, creating ties between memory and land that are deeper than seasonal convenience. Some gather wild cereals with such intensity that plant foods become central to settlement patterns. Heavy ground stone tools appear in ways that suggest processing is not occasional, but woven into the structure of life. Dogs may be present in some contexts, though details of early domestication remain debated. Gazelle hunting, wild grain gathering, nut collection, bird trapping, fishing, and broad-spectrum foraging continue. But they are increasingly organised around places that feel less temporary than the brush huts of earlier ages. The Natufian does not represent a single people with a single way of life. It is a broad archaeological pattern across the Levant, with variation from one valley, terrace, cave, and open-air settlement to another. What survives in the record suggests a mosaic of communities adapting to local opportunities. Some sites show substantial stone-built structures. Some show repeated occupations. Some show decorated objects, beads, carved stone, and personal ornaments. Some show burials that imply emotional and social ties to particular locations. Scholars still debate how sedentary different Natufian groups really were, and the answer probably varies from place to place and season to season. But the direction is unmistakable enough to matter. In certain landscapes, the human relationship with place is becoming more durable. Durability changes everything. A camp that is used for a few days can be abandoned with little consequence. A place that is used for generations becomes a container of memory. The ground holds ancestors. Paths become inherited. Storage pits, hearths, house floors, walls, and working areas create habits that shape the next season before it begins. If people know they will return, they can leave heavy tools behind. If tools remain, the place itself becomes more useful. If a place is more useful, more people may gather there. If more people gather, the social world grows denser. Cooperation becomes more necessary, but so does negotiation. Food must be shared, stored, claimed, protected, or redistributed according to customs that leave only faint archaeological traces. The evidence remains incomplete, but the logic is powerful. Settlement is not just a change in architecture, it is a change in time. In this world, wild cereals become more than food. They become calendar markers. Their ripening shapes movement and labour. Their collection requires baskets, sickle blades, cutting techniques, processing areas, drying, pounding, grinding, and cooking. Some sickle blades develop a gloss from repeated cutting of grasses, a small shine on stone that speaks of countless motions of the hand. It is not dramatic evidence, but it is intimate evidence. The blade does not tell us what people believed or how they organized every meal. It tells us that certain plants mattered enough to be harvested repeatedly. Again, this is not yet the Mesopotamian grain field, but the distance is narrowing in one important sense. People are investing more labor in resources that reward attention, timing, and repetition. The surprising part is that this more settled life does not arise only after agriculture makes it easy. In some places, the opposite seems closer to the truth. Sedentism begins before full domestication. People settle more, or return more intensively, while still relying heavily on wild resources. That reverses the older assumption that farming must come first and villages second. The Natufian world shows that villages, or village-like places, can emerge from rich foraging economies when conditions allow. This does not mean farming was inevitable. Nothing in prehistory is inevitable. Many communities live successfully without agriculture, and some may have had little reason to embrace its labor demands. Farming can increase food supply, but it can also increase work, disease exposure, social tension, and dependence on uncertain harvests. The move toward cultivation was not simply a brilliant invention that everyone immediately recognized as progress. It was a complicated bargain. Then comes one of the great disruptions, the Younger Dryas, a return to cooler and drier conditions after a period of warming. Its effects vary across regions, and scholars still debate exactly how it influenced the origins of agriculture. It would be too easy to say climate stress forced people to farm. The truth is more tangled. In some areas, changing climate may have made wild resources less predictable. In others, it may have encouraged communities already attached to certain places to experiment more intensely with managing plants. Pressure alone does not create agriculture, but pressure acting on communities that already know wild cereals intimately, already live in semi-sedentary ways, already possess grinding tools, storage habits, social networks, and place-based memory can push old practices into new forms. This is the hidden drama between Ahalo II and the first Neolithic villages. The breakthrough is not a single invention but a tightening relationship between people, plants, animals, and place. Every return makes the landscape more familiar. Every harvest teaches the timing of growth. Every abandoned seed, trampled patch, cleared area, and burned zone changes the local ecology slightly. In the long run, humans are no longer just adapting to environments. They are creating niches within them. They are becoming a force in the life cycles of the species around them. They still live within nature, but nature is beginning to carry human fingerprints more clearly. The emotional world of this threshold is harder to see. Stone walls and grinding slabs survive better than songs, fears, obligations, or memories. Yet the burials and repeated occupations suggest that people are attaching identity to place in ways that later civilizations will magnify. A city is not merely a large settlement. It is a settlement that remembers itself, organizes itself, and reproduces its own importance across generations. The first forms of that deeper attachment do not need writing. They can begin with a grave near a house, a hearth rebuilt in the same spot, a tool left for return, a path to a spring, a cluster of people who know where they belong when the season changes. By the end of this threshold, the world before Sumer has become far more complex than a blank map of wandering bands. It is a landscape of experiments, some brief, some enduring, some forgotten, some foundational. In the Levant, the first steps towards sedentary life emerge from foragers who are already skilled, observant, and socially organized. Their lives do not yet produce cities, but they produce something cities will need: rootedness, the idea that a place can hold people, and that people can hold a place in memory, becomes stronger. The old lakeshore camp has not vanished from the story. Its smoke still seems to drift faintly through this later world, where seeds, stones, shelters, and remembered ground begin to gather into a new human possibility. When the first stone buildings of the Neolithic begin to rise, they do not look like the beginning of a city. They look stranger than that. They appear in a world still balanced between hunting and farming, between seasonal memory and permanent settlement, between the older freedom of movement and the heavier gravity of place. In southeastern Anatolia, near the upper reaches of Mesopotamia, but far from the later mud brick cities of Sumer, people gather on limestone hills, quarry stone, shape pillars, carve animals, and arrange spaces that seem to belong as much to memory and ritual as to shelter. The old story once tried to place all this after agriculture, as if farming first created surplus, surplus created specialists, and specialists created monuments. But Göbeklitepe and the wider Taş Tepeler landscape disturb that neat sequence. Here, monumental architecture appears at a time when the people involved are not yet living inside the full agricultural world that later villages will know. The hill of Göbeklitepe does not rise like a ziggurat over a city. There are no streets around it, no royal tombs, no clay tablets, no clear evidence of an urban population administering labour through writing. Instead, there are circular and oval enclosures, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, carved foxes, snakes, birds, boars, wild cattle, and other animals from a world still vivid with dangerous life. Some pillars are abstract, but others seem almost bodily. They carry arms, hands, belts, and forms that suggest stylized human figures, silent and towering, standing among animals. This is one of the lesser-known shocks of the site. The pillars are not merely decorated stones. Many scholars interpret them as something like human-shaped beings, perhaps ancestors, powerful figures, or presences whose meaning is lost. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the carvings, the architecture, or the social world behind them. But the scale of the work is undeniable. People who did not yet write and may not yet have farmed in the later sense gathered enough labour and shared enough purpose to reshape a hilltop. For years, Göbeklitepe was often presented as a lone miracle, a temple before agriculture, a sudden eruption of complexity out of nowhere. That version is dramatic, but it is too clean. The growing picture from Taş Tepeler is richer and more unsettling. Göbeklitepe is not an isolated exception. It belongs to a broader Neolithic cultural landscape across southeastern Turkey, with sites such as Karahantepe, Seyburt, Sefertepe, and others showing related forms of architecture, carved stone, communal spaces, and symbolic expression. The mystery becomes larger precisely because it becomes less unique. A single monument could be treated as an anomaly. A network of sites suggests a world. It suggests communities communicating, borrowing styles, sharing beliefs, competing, gathering, or at least participating in overlapping traditions across a region that later histories once passed over too quickly. The people who build these places are not simple hunter-gatherers in the careless sense of the phrase. They are inheritors of thousands of years of knowledge about wild grains, animals, stone, seasonal movement, and landscape memory. They know where limestone can be cut. They know how to organize quarrying and transport. They know how to shape a pillar that may weigh many tons and set it upright with tools that leave no trace of metal. They know how to feed gatherings, whether through hunting, collecting wild plants, early cultivation, or some combination still debated. They know how to create forms that matter to people beyond immediate survival. This is the point at which the word civilization becomes slippery. If civilization means cities, writing, formal states, taxation, and bureaucratic institutions, this is not civilization. If it means human beings coordinating large projects around shared meanings, investing labour into places that outlive them, and creating symbolic worlds visible in architecture, then the roots are already deep in the ground. The surrounding environment is crucial. The early Holocene brings warmer conditions after the Ice Age, and in parts of the Fertile Crescent, wild cereals, pistachio, almond, gazelle, aurochs, wild sheep, and other resources form dense ecological opportunities. But opportunity is not destiny. Many regions of the world had rich environments without producing Göbeklitepe. Something more specific happens here. Human groups begin to gather at particular places and make those places important through repeated action. Stone enclosures become anchors. Carved animals become more than animals. They may evoke danger, identity, memory, hunting power, seasonal cycles, or mythic relationships we can only approach indirectly. Scholars still debate whether these buildings were primarily ritual centres, communal houses, special gathering spaces, or something that does not fit modern categories. The old division between sacred and practical may itself be misleading. In small-scale societies, food, memory, death, landscape, animal life, and social bonds can be woven together so tightly that separating temple from meeting house may tell us more about modern expectations than ancient reality. Karahantepe deepens this uncertainty. Its carved pillars and special buildings suggest that Göbeklitepe is part of a wider experimentation with bodies, animals, and enclosed spaces. At some Taş Tepeler sites, human heads, benches, channels, and carved forms appear in ways that feel intimate and unsettling. Seyburt offers another extraordinary clue, with a carved scene often discussed as one of the earliest known narrative reliefs human figures and animals arranged not as isolated symbols, but in composition that seems to imply action, tension, and story. No one can read it the way a later inscription can be read. There are no words beneath the figures telling us what happens. Yet the arrangement suggests that people are already using stone to hold a story still. Before writing fixes speech into signs, images can fix moments into memory. This matters for the road to Sumer because later Mesopotamian civilization will be built around institutions that turn memory into power. Temples store goods, Scribes record obligations, cities organize labor, myths explain kingship and divine favor. But long before those systems, communities are already discovering that shared places and shared images can bind people together. A carved pillar does not count barley, but it can gather people. A circular enclosure does not administer a state, but it can focus labor. A relief does not write history, but it can preserve a scene long enough for later generations to stand before it and understand that something important happened there, even if the exact meaning changes. The real mystery, then, is not whether Göbeklitepe was the first civilization. It was not, at least not in the urban sense. The deeper mystery is why people at this particular threshold began to build so greatly before the full machinery of farming villages and cities appeared. Perhaps communal feasts helped draw groups together. Perhaps ritual obligations encouraged cooperation across scattered communities. Perhaps competition among groups encouraged more impressive spaces. Perhaps changing environments made gathering places more necessary. Perhaps early cultivation and intensified hunting created new social pressures. The evidence supports fragments of these explanations, but none of them alone is enough. What survives in the record suggests a world in motion, where old mobile lifeways and new forms of place-based identity overlap. At the edge of the enclosures, the distinction between past and future becomes difficult to hold. Behind these builders lies the long memory of Ohalo too: wild seeds, lake fish, brush huts, grinding stones, and camps sealed by mud. Ahead of them lie villages with plastered floors, dense houses, domesticated plants and animals, and eventually the immense alluvial cities of southern Mesopotamia. But here, on the limestone heights, the story pauses in a stranger middle ground. People who have not yet become citizens, farmers in the later sense, or subjects of kings, are already raising stones that can outlast them by 10,000 years. They stand before carved animals and silent human-like pillars in a world where history has not begun to write, but memory has already begun to build. The stones of Göbeklitepe and Karahantepe do not stand alone in the mind for long. Once one accepts that these places are not isolated miracles, the landscape around them begins to change. Hills, valleys, limestone ridges, springs, hunting grounds, flint sources, and pathways between settlements become part of the same problem. A pillar is not only a pillar, it implies quarrying, transport, coordination, food, timing, skill, and some shared reason for people to gather. A carved animal is not only an image, it implies memory, attention, danger, identity, and a world in which animals are not background scenery but active forces in human thought. The broader Taş Tepeler region begins to look less like a scattering of sites and more like a cultural horizon, a network of places where early Neolithic communities experiment with architecture, symbolism, and belonging at a scale that was once difficult to imagine before farming villages had fully taken hold. This is where the story becomes more human and more difficult. Monumental places can trick the eye. They make the past seem dominated by great stones, when most of life still happens in smaller, warmer, more perishable spaces. People wake, gather fuel, carry water, repair tools, process food, scrape hides, shape beads, cut reeds, move through dust, smoke, and animal smell. They know hunger and abundance by season. They know where gazelle pass, where wild cereals ripen, where pistachios and almonds can be found, where rain has been kind and where the ground has failed. They may come to special buildings for gatherings that are not daily life, or they may live closer to these places than earlier models assumed. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between ritual structures and ordinary settlement in the Taş Tepeler world, partly because the evidence is still emerging, and partly because the modern categories of temple, house, shrine, village, and meeting hall may not fit comfortably. The people who built these places may not have separated the practical and the sacred in the way later urban societies often did. One of the most important shifts in recent interpretation is the idea of community, not community as a sentimental word, but as a hard archaeological problem. How do groups coordinate labor without kings? How do they create spaces recognized by people beyond one household? How do they bring together food, work, belief, memory, and obligation before writing exists to command it? The answer is not simple. It may lie partly in feasting, in the gathering of many people for events where food and symbolism reinforce one another. It may lie in shared ancestry, in stories attached to particular hills or animals. It may lie in seasonal aggregation, when groups that spend parts of the year apart come together to exchange partners, materials, news, obligations, and rituals. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale and persistence of these sites. But what survives in the record suggests that architecture is becoming a tool for holding people together. Feasting is often mentioned because it offers a practical bridge between subsistence and ceremony. To build a large enclosure, people must be fed to bring people together. Food must be prepared in quantities larger than everyday need. The remains of animals, stone vessels, grinding tools, and food processing traces at early Neolithic sites have encouraged the idea that communal consumption played a role in social life. This does not mean every carved enclosure was simply a dining hall, or that every gathering was a feast in the modern festive sense. It means that food, labor, and meaning may have reinforced each other. People work because a place matters. A place matters more because people work there. Food rewards the gathering, and the gathering creates memory. That memory gives people a reason to return. The animals carved on the stones are part of this return. They're not domesticated herds calmly standing under human control. They're wild creatures, foxes, snakes, boars, cranes, scorpions, aurochs, and other beings that suggest danger, speed, alertness, and power. Later civilization will often represent animals as property, offerings, divine symbols, or controlled resources. Here the animals still feel like presences from a world humans negotiate with rather than dominate. Some may represent hunted species, some may belong to stories or identities no longer recoverable. Some may mark the emotional charge of living among animals that could feed, threaten, guide, or haunt the imagination. The evidence remains incomplete, and any interpretation risks making the carvings too tidy. Yet the repeated attention to wild creatures shows that the boundary between human community and the non-human world is central to the meaning of these places. Then there are the human forms, the T-shaped pillars with arms and hands, the carved heads, the benches, the bodily imagery at Tepe and other sites all suggest that the Neolithic imagination is deeply concerned with bodies. Sometimes the body is monumental and abstract, towering as a pillar. Sometimes it is reduced to a head, a gesture, a face, or an ambiguous form. At Saburs, the relief scene is especially striking because figures appear in relation to one another, with animals and humans arranged in a way that feels narrative rather than merely decorative. It is one of those moments where archaeology seems to approach a story but cannot enter it. The stone shows composition, tension, and intention, but not explanation. It preserves the surface of meaning while the meaning itself has gone. This silence is part of the fascination. Sumer will later give us names, titles, accounts, myths, hymns, and administrative lists, not full understanding, but words. The pre-Sumerian Neolithic gives us a different kind of archive architecture without inscriptions, bodies without biographies, animals without captions, buried structures without written memory. It is an archive of action rather than speech. People quarry, carve, arrange, fill, rebuild, and sometimes deliberately bury. That last detail is important. Some enclosures at Göbeklitepe appear to have been intentionally filled in, an act that may have been practical, ritual, or both. A society that buries its own great buildings is not merely losing them. It may be closing them, transforming them, or placing them beyond ordinary use. Scholars still debate the meaning of this, but it suggests that the life of a monument includes its ending. The wider Taş Tepeler landscape also complicates the old boundary between hunter and farmer. These communities live in a time when cultivation is emerging, but the balance between wild and managed resources varies. They are not yet the fully agricultural village societies of later centuries, but they are also not simply mobile foragers in the older stereotype. They occupy a threshold where hunting, gathering, early cultivation, architecture, and symbolic life are tangled together. In that tangle, the later world begins to appear in outline. Not cities yet, but gathering places. Not states, but organized labor. Not writing, but durable symbols. Not kings, but perhaps powerful traditions capable of moving many hands toward a shared project. This is why the phrase before Sumer should not sound empty. Before Sumer, there is not a void. There's a long sequence of communities testing different ways of being human in place. Some of those experiments leave only seeds and ash. Some leave walls. Some leave towers. Some leave carved pillars on hilltops. The great mistake is to imagine civilization as a switch that turned on in southern Mesopotamia. Sumer matters because it concentrated many developments into a new urban form. But the human capacities beneath that form had been gathering for ages. Across the limestone hills, the people of Taş Tepeler are still living close to the wild. Their world has not yet been flattened into fields and accounts. Animals stare from stone. Human-like pillars stand without names. Buildings rise, are used, changed, and buried. The communities who make them leave no written explanation, but they leave enough to unsettle the old timeline. Long before the first city writes itself into history, people are already building places that ask to be remembered. Far to the south of the limestone hills, another place begins to gather people around itself with a different kind of gravity. It does not announce itself with carved animals standing on pillars, or with silent T-shaped figures watching from circles of stone. It rises in a warmer basin, near a powerful spring, close to the edge of desert and cultivation, where water can turn danger into abundance and abundance into permanence. This is Jericho, or Tell Sultan, one of the most famous names in the deep history of settlement, and one of the easiest to misunderstand. Later stories will wrap Jericho in walls, conquest, trumpets, and memory. But the deeper archaeological Jericho belongs to a much older world, one that appears thousands of years before Sumer and long before the biblical city enters written imagination. Its earliest importance lies not in a single dramatic event, but in the stubborn fact of people remaining. To remain in one place is never as simple as it sounds. A permanent or semi-permanent settlement is not just a camp that lasts longer. It is a reorganization of life. Food must come in reliably enough to support people who are no longer always moving toward the next seasonal resource. Waste accumulates. Houses need repair. Stored food attracts pests and creates new social obligations. Nearby land is used again and again. Water becomes precious not only for drinking, but for identity, planning, and control. Neighbours become unavoidable. Memory becomes anchored. The place begins to have a past that every new generation must live with. At Jericho, the Great Spring helps make that possible. Water in a dry landscape is not merely a resource, it is destiny with a source point. The earliest substantial settlement at Tel Sultan belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a time before ceramics become common, but after human communities in the region have already begun to transform their relationship with plants, animals, and architecture. Here, houses cluster. Mud brick becomes a material of ordinary permanence. Floors are prepared and renewed. People live close enough for the settlement itself to become a social organism. Most famously, Jericho is associated with massive early stoneworks, a wall, a ditch, and a tower whose purpose scholars still debate. The tower, rising from the Neolithic settlement, is among the most arresting structures of the ancient world before cities. It is not a ziggurat. It is not a palace. It is not part of a literate state. Yet it demands labour, planning, and the ability to build something far beyond immediate household need. The old interpretation often imagined Jericho's wall as a defensive structure, a sign that settled life brought conflict and protection. That may be part of the story, but the evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the tower and wall. Some scholars have suggested flood control, especially given the settlement's position near a wadi system where sudden water could be dangerous. Others have proposed social or ritual purposes, a way to bind the community through collective labour or mark the settlement's identity in the landscape. The tower itself, with its internal staircase, feels almost too deliberate to reduce to one function. It may have watched, protected, displayed, organised, symbolised, or combined these roles in ways modern categories separate too neatly. The uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Jericho shows that very early permanent communities were already solving problems that were practical and symbolic at the same time. This is one of the great differences between the world of Ohalo II and the world of Jericho. At the lakeshore camp, place matters but remains light enough to be left behind. At Jericho, place becomes heavy. The settlement can be repaired, expanded, inherited, defended, remembered, and transformed. The ground itself begins to thicken into a tell, a mound created by repeated human occupation, where houses fall, new houses rise on the ruins, floors are laid over older floors, and time becomes vertical. A tell is one of the most powerful images in Near Eastern archaeology because it is literally human memory turned into earth. People do not set out to build a mound. They live, rebuild, sweep, abandon, return, and build again. Centuries later, the settlement has lifted itself above the plain on the weight of its own past. The daily life behind this mound is not less important than the tower. It is easy to let monumental stone pull attention away from mud brick rooms, grinding stones, food preparation, baskets, mats, tools, and the management of ordinary time. Jericho's people live in a world where cultivation is increasingly important, but where hunting, gathering, and flexible use of the environment still matter. The transition to farming is not an instant replacement of old life ways. Wild resources continue. Domestic plants and animals become more central at different speeds in different places. Scholars still debate the exact timing and character of local domestication processes. but what survives in the record suggests an increasingly committed village life. People invest in houses because they expect to stay. They cultivate because staying makes certain plants worth managing more intensively. They store because cultivation and gathering create seasonal abundance. They build collectively because a dense settlement creates risks and possibilities that isolated camps do not have. There is also a human intimacy in early Jericho that feels very far from the later image of anonymous cities. Pre-pottery Neolithic communities in the broader Levant are known for practices involving the treatment of ancestors, including plastered skulls in some sites, where faces were carefully modelled after death. The exact meaning varies and remains debated, but such practices suggest that identity, memory, household, and land were bound together with unusual force. Ancestors could become part of the architecture of belonging. The dead were not merely gone, they could remain socially present, tied to houses, lineages, and places. This is not yet the royal tomb or the written genealogy. It is older and more domestic, a kind of memory that lives under floors and within the settlement itself. That relationship between the living, the dead, and the built environment helps explain why early settlements are more than economic machines. A village is not just an efficient way to produce food, it is a way to hold a community across time. It makes cooperation more visible, but also more complicated. People must negotiate access to water, fields, stored food, building space, ritual obligations, and household identity. Inequality in the later urban sense may not yet dominate, but differences in status, ancestry, skill, and social role may already be developing. The evidence is too fragmentary to describe the full political life of Jericho's earliest inhabitants. But the architecture makes one thing clear: people are learning to live with the consequences of permanence. The surprising thing is how early this lesson appears. Jericho's Neolithic tower stands thousands of years before Uruk's great urban expansion. When Sumerian cities eventually rise in the alluvial south, they will inherit a world where mud brick architecture, cultivation, storage, ritual memory, communal labour, and settlement identity have already been tested for millennia. Sumer is revolutionary, but it is not born from emptiness. It stands at the far end of experiments that began in camps. Villages, ritual centres, and spring-fed settlements scattered across Western Asia. At Jericho, civilization is still not fully present, if by civilization we mean writing, cities, states, and class institutions. But the shadow of civilization is longer now. The tower rises from a world without kings whose names we know, yet it proves that people can organize labor around a shared project before bureaucracy. The walls or stone works enclose more than space, they enclose memory. The spring flows, houses cluster, floors are renewed, and the mound slowly grows beneath human feet. In that growth, the old mobile world does not vanish completely, but something irreversible has begun. A place has become powerful enough to hold generations. After Jericho, the story no longer feels like a question of whether people can remain in one place. They can. The deeper question becomes what happens to human life when remaining becomes ordinary. A spring-fed settlement with a tower shows one version of permanence, but permanence has many shapes, and one of the strangest appears farther north and west, on the Anatolian plain, where a vast mound of houses grows slowly upward over many centuries. Çatalhöyük does not look like a city in the later Mesopotamian sense. It has no obvious palace, no written administration, no streets in the usual meaning of the word, and no king whose name survives. Yet it is too dense, too long-lived, and too symbolically rich to be dismissed as a simple village. It belongs to that unsettling middle world before Sumer, where settlement has become powerful, but urban civilization has not yet taken its familiar form. At Çatalhöyük, houses crowd together wall against wall, so tightly that movement seems to happen across roofs rather than through streets. People enter many homes from above, descending by ladders into rooms where cooking, sleeping, storage, craft, ritual, and memory overlap. The roof is not merely a cover, it is a pathway, a working surface, perhaps a social space, a place where daily movement turns the settlement into something like a living platform. This is a startling idea for anyone used to cities made of roads and doorways. Here, the settlement's public face may have been its rooftops, while the interiors below hold the dense, smoky, plastered intimacy of household life. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how movement, access, privacy, and neighborhood organization worked in practice. But the architecture suggests a form of community, unlike both a loose village and a later city. Inside the houses, the world narrows and deepens. Plastered platforms line the rooms. Hearths and ovens mark the places where heat, smoke, food, and daily labor gather. Storage bins hold the practical future of the household. Walls are replastered again and again, sometimes many times, creating surfaces that are not just maintained but renewed. In some houses, paintings, reliefs, animal installations, and symbolic features appear. Bull horns, often called bucrania, are set into walls or platforms. Geometric designs, handprints, animals, and scenes of human activity appear across the settlement's long history. Not every house is equally elaborate, and not every image can be confidently interpreted. But what survives suggests that domestic space is not separate from symbolic life. The home is not merely where people sleep, it is where they cook, remember, display, bury, renew, and belong. This is one of Çatalhöyük's most important lessons. In later Mesopotamia, temples and public institutions will become central to the organization of urban society. Sacred and administrative power will rise in buildings larger than ordinary homes. At Çatalhöyük, by contrast, much of the symbolic weight seems to remain inside houses. Some rooms are more decorated than others, and some may have had special importance. But there is no simple division between temple and home. The community appears to be organized through households rather than through a centralized institution visible in monumental public architecture. No single explanation fully accounts for the social order of the settlement, and scholars still debate whether differences between houses indicate status, ancestry, ritual, responsibility, or variations in household history. What is clear is that people are living in a world where the house has become a container of identity across generations. The dead deepen that identity. At Çatalhöyük, people are often buried beneath house floors and platforms, in the spaces where the living continue their daily routines. This practice is not unique in the Neolithic Near East, but here it is especially powerful because of the density and longevity of the settlement. The household becomes layered with memory in the most literal sense. The living walk, work, cook, and sleep above earlier members of the community. The past is underfoot, not far away in a separate cemetery beyond the settlement. This does not mean we can easily reconstruct belief. The evidence does not let us enter the minds of the people who place their dead beneath floors, but it does show that houses are not disposable shelters. They are places where continuity matters, where the boundary between architecture and ancestry becomes thin. Daily life in such a settlement is both impressive and difficult. Permanent density brings advantages: shared labor, exchange of materials, social cooperation, defense through proximity, and the ability to maintain fields, herds, and stores. But it also brings new pressures. Smoke from indoor hearths affects air quality. Waste must be managed. Disease risks can rise when people live close together and keep animals nearby, even if the exact patterns vary. Food production requires repeated work. Planting, harvesting, herding, grinding, cooking, repairing storage, maintaining tools. Farming is not an escape from hardship. It is a different contract with time. Instead of moving widely across a landscape of seasonal abundance, people invest in cycles that tie them more tightly to fields, herds, houses, and neighbours. This can produce security, but it can also produce dependence. The tools of Çatalhöyük reveal a world connected beyond itself. Obsidian, that dark volcanic glass prized for its sharpness and beauty, circulates through Anatolia and beyond. Its presence reminds us that Neolithic settlements are not isolated islands. Materials move through exchange networks, visits, partnerships, obligations, and perhaps long-distance journeys. Obsidian blades gleam with a quality unlike ordinary stone, almost liquid in their fractured surfaces. They cut with astonishing sharpness, and they also carry social value. A household using obsidian participates in a wider landscape of contact. Long before merchants record transactions in Mesopotamian accounts, objects are already moving through human relationships that leave no written contracts behind. Çatalhöyük also gives us one of the more debated images in prehistoric archaeology, a wall painting sometimes interpreted as a map-like view of the settlement with a volcanic eruption behind it. Some have connected it to Hasan Dağ, a volcano visible in the wider region, though the interpretation remains disputed. It may be a landscape, a symbolic pattern, a skin, a geometric design, or something else entirely. The uncertainty is valuable because it shows how easily modern observers want images to become documents. If it is a map, it would be extraordinary. If it is not, it is still extraordinary. Because it shows that people were making visual worlds inside their homes thousands of years before writing. Either way, the painting refuses to become simple. In the long arc towards Sumer, Çatalhöyük marks a crucial experiment, a dense settlement without clear urban hierarchy, a large community where houses rather than palaces seem to organize life, and where memory is built through repeated plastering, burial, decoration, and rebuilding. It shows that size alone does not make a city. A settlement can be large, creative, connected, and long-lived without becoming Uruk. The path to civilization is therefore not just about getting bigger. It is about how people manage power, labor, food, memory, and difference as they grow. By the time southern Mesopotamia begins its own rise, the human world has already tested many possible futures. Ohlalo too shows return. Jericho shows permanence and communal construction. Taş Tepeler shows monumental gathering before full urban life. Çatalhöyük shows dense domestic worlds where houses carry the weight of society. None of these is Sumer, yet each reveals something Sumer will later transform. The first cities do not emerge because humans suddenly learn to build, store, symbolize, or remember. They emerge after millennia in which people have been doing all of those things in different forms, in different places, under different skies. At Çatalhöyük, the roofs stretch across the settlement like a second ground, and beneath them, in plastered rooms glowing with firelight, the long experiment of living together grows heavier, deeper, and harder to leave. As houses grow denser and settlements become heavier with memory, Another transformation begins to appear in the archaeological record, quieter than a tower and smaller than a carved pillar, but just as important. People begin to mark themselves with increasing care. They shape beads, pendants, stone rings, bone objects, shell ornaments, and personal decorations that do not feed a household or hold up a roof, yet clearly matter. The body becomes a surface of identity. In a world where more people live closer together, where households remember their dead beneath floors, where gatherings draw communities into shared spaces, the question of who a person is becomes more visible. Not visible to us in the way writing later makes names visible, but visible in objects worn against skin, displayed in hair, fastened through clothing, or perhaps attached to the body itself, before seals, titles, uniforms, and written ranks. There are ornaments. This is not a sudden invention of beauty. Humans have made and worn symbolic objects long before the Neolithic. Shell beads, pigments, pendants, and decorated materials appeared deep in the Paleolithic, across many parts of the world. The urge to mark identity, affiliation, memory, or status is far older than farming. But in the early settled communities of Western Asia, ornamentation takes on a different social atmosphere. People are no longer meeting only in small, mobile groups whose members know one another intimately across daily movement. They are living in larger clusters, returning to communal places, participating in networks, exchanging materials across distance, and negotiating household identity over generations. Under those conditions, the visible body may become more socially charged. A bead is never merely a bead if everyone understands where it comes from, who may wear it, how it is made, or what stage of a life it marks. Boncuklu in southeastern Turkey brings this world into focus with unusual intimacy. The site belongs to the broad pre-pottery Neolithic horizon, and among its finds are ornaments and bodily practices that suggest people were not simply decorating clothing or carrying attractive objects. Some evidence points toward forms of corporal ornamentation, including objects that may have been worn in relation to the face or body, and wear patterns that hint at long-term use. The details are technical, and scholars still debate how to interpret all of the associations. But the broader implication is striking. Neolithic identity may have been worn not only around the neck or wrist, but through deliberate bodily display. The body itself could become a social document before writing existed. That phrase should be used carefully. These are not documents in the literal sense. They do not tell us names, clans, professions, or beliefs. Yet they record social choices. They show that people invested labour in small things whose meaning depended on being seen. Some ornaments required specialised raw materials, some required drilling, polishing, shaping, and repeated handling. Some may have travelled through exchange networks before reaching the person who wore them. A tiny bead can therefore carry a geography. It can connect a household to a distant source, a craft tradition, a social relationship, or a memory of exchange. In later Mesopotamia, identity will often be stamped on clay through cylinder seals and administrative marks. Here, identity is carried on the body, in materials that move with the person. The surprising detail is how much these small objects reveal about the complexity of early settled life. A settlement needs food, shelter, water, and tools, but a community needs recognition. People must know who belongs, who is connected to whom, who has passed through certain life stages, who carries obligations, who may speak in gatherings, who is associated with particular houses, ancestors, animals, or places. Archaeology cannot reconstruct those rules directly. The evidence remains incomplete, but ornaments suggest that rules existed, because display only matters when others can read it. A pendant with no shared meaning is only an object. A pendant understood by a community becomes a sign. At the same time, the Neolithic body is not only decorated, it is also imagined, carved, buried, modelled, and sometimes transformed after death. Across the wider region, human heads, figurines, plastered skulls, stylized bodies, and relief suggest an intense concern with human form. The dead may be kept close to houses. Skulls may be treated separately in some traditions. Faces may be modelled or remembered. These practices vary widely and should not be forced into one belief system. But they show that early settled communities are thinking with bodies in powerful ways. The body's not just biological, it is social, ancestral, symbolic, and architectural. It belongs to the house, to the community, to the landscape, and perhaps to unseen forces whose names are lost. This makes the animal imagery of Taş Tepeler feel different as well. The carved wild creatures are not isolated symbols floating outside human society. They appear in a world where people are also marking themselves, shaping human forms, treating skulls, building special spaces, and creating shared scenes in stone. Human and animal identities may have been entangled. Certain animals may have represented dangers, groups, stories, seasons, or powers. Certain bodily ornaments may have marked participation in those same symbolic worlds. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, and it would be misleading to pretend we can decode the images as if they were an alphabet. But the repeated attention to bodies, animal presences, and display suggests a society where identity is performed, remembered, and perhaps transformed through material forms. Food production and hunting also belong to this same social world. In southeastern Anatolia, evidence for large-scale hunting installations, sometimes described through the wider phenomenon of desert kites and related trapping landscapes, suggests that communal hunting could require planning across open terrain. Such systems are not simply about killing animals. They require knowledge of movement, topography, cooperation, timing, and group coordination. The details of early use remain debated by site and region, but the broader point is important before city-states organize labor through command. Communities are already capable of coordinated action across landscapes. A hunt can be a logistical event, a social gathering, a source of food, and a display of group competence all at once. Like a feast, it can bind people through shared risk and shared reward. This is one of the hidden bridges to later civilization. The early Neolithic does not yet have the bureaucratic apparatus of Uruk, but it has social memory, symbolic authority, labor coordination, craft production, long-distance exchange, settlement identity, and embodied signs of belonging. These are not minor details. They are the human machinery that later institutions will formalize. Writing does not create social complexity from nothing. It captures, stabilizes, and expands forms of obligation that already exist. Temples do not invent gathering, they monumentalize it. Cities do not invent identity, they multiply and regulate it. Administration does not invent cooperation. It disciplines cooperation into recordable systems. The people of Bonkuklutala, Çatalhöyük, Jericho, and the Taş Tepeler landscape live in worlds that are not yet urban, but they are already thick with signs. A polished bead catches light near a hearth, a carved animal watches from stone, a skull rests beneath a floor, a house is replastered, a path leads to a gathering place. A group returns after a season and recognizes the marks left before. These are small acts, but they accumulate into something durable. They teach people to live inside shared meanings larger than immediate survival. By the time Sumer appears, the visible signs will change. The body will still matter, but seals, tablets, buildings, ranks, and offices will begin to speak more loudly in the record. Names will enter clay. Goods will be counted. Labor will be assigned. Gods will have temples with economic power. Yet beneath that later world there lies this older one, where human identity is carried in ornaments, houses, burials, animals, and stone. Before civilization learns to write people down, people have already learned to make themselves recognizable to one another, and in that recognition, another foundation is laid. Once identity becomes visible, labor becomes visible too. Not in written accounts, not yet in lists of workers or rations, but in the physical scale of things that cannot be made by one household alone. A tower at Jericho, a special building at Tepe, a buried enclosure at Göbeklitepe, a dense settlement like Çatalhöyük, a trapping landscape stretched across open ground, each one carries the same quiet implication. People are learning how to coordinate effort beyond the family hearth. They are learning how to turn many separate bodies into one temporary force. Long before the first Sumerian administrator counts baskets of barley, communities are already solving the older problem that every civilization must eventually face: how to persuade, obligate, inspire, or pressure people to work together on something larger than immediate need. In the early Neolithic world of Southwest Asia, this coordination does not yet appear as command from a palace. It is more elusive. It may happen through kinship, ritual obligation, seasonal gathering, shared hunting, feasting, ancestry, exchange, marriage ties, rivalry, or the prestige of those who know how to organize a difficult task. The evidence remains incomplete, because archaeology preserves the result of labor more easily than the social voice that summoned it. A pillar stands, but the agreement behind it is gone. A wall remains, but the argument over building it has vanished. A line of stones may reveal a communal hunting installation, but not the songs, signals, rules, or memories that guided the people who used it. Still, the built and altered landscape makes one thing unavoidable. Human cooperation has become architecturally powerful. The evidence for mass hunting in parts of Southwest Asia adds an especially sharp edge to this picture. In landscapes such as Şanlıurfa and the surrounding region, archaeological work has drawn attention to large-scale hunting systems and structures associated with directing animals through space. These features belong to a broader tradition of using terrain, walls, guiding lines, and traps to manage the movement of wild herds. Their exact dates, functions, and relationships to nearby settlements vary and remain debated, but their presence near the dawn of sedentary life is significant. They suggest that early communities were not merely waiting for domestication to place animals under human control. They were already reshaping landscapes to make animal movement predictable. They were turning geography into a tool. That idea carries enormous consequences. Hunting is often imagined as a small group activity, quick and mobile, based on tracking and weapons. But large-scale hunting systems require a different kind of intelligence. People must understand how animals react to barriers, slopes, openings, pressure, noise, and group movement. They must choose locations where the land itself can do part of the work. They must build or maintain features that may only be useful at certain times. They must gather enough participants to make the system function. They must process the result, distribute food, manage surplus if there is any, and remember when the system should be used again. This is not farming, but it is management. It is not domestication, but it is control. It is not a state, but it is organized power applied to a landscape. The surprising point is that such systems may belong to the same world that builds symbolic spaces. The people carving animals on pillars are not removed from the practical realities of animal life. They know animals as food, danger, movement, pattern, and power. The boar, fox, snake, bird, gazelle, aurochs, and wild sheep are not decorative subjects floating above subsistence. They are part of a lived environment where human survival depends on attention to non-human behavior. A carved animal may hold symbolic meaning, but that symbolism is rooted in intimate knowledge. The people who carve wild creatures in stone may also track them, trap them, butcher them, eat them, fear them, imitate them, and tell stories about them. The symbolic world does not replace the practical one. It intensifies it. This is also where feasting becomes more than a pleasant possibility. If a mass hunt produces abundance, even temporarily, that abundance can do social work. Meat can feed builders. It can reward visitors. It can mark gatherings. It can create debts, alliances, memories, and obligations. It can make a place famous. A successful event can be remembered long after the bones are scattered and broken. The feast may help explain how mobile or semi-mobile groups are drawn into repeated cooperation. But scholars still debate how central feasting was, and it would be too simple to turn every monument into the byproduct of a banquet. Food is part of the answer, not the whole answer. People do not carve pillars only because they are well fed. They carve them because the place, the gathering, the animals, the dead, the stories, or the community itself demands form. As cultivation becomes more important, another kind of labour begins to tighten around human life. Fields, even early and small ones, require preparation, sowing, weeding, watching, harvesting, threshing, grinding, storing, and protecting. Herds, once animal management develops more fully, require movement, care, breeding knowledge, and defense against loss. These activities reshape the calendar. They reduce some uncertainties and create others. A hunter-gatherer can sometimes move away from a failed patch. A farming household cannot easily move away from a field at the wrong moment. Investment creates attachment. Attachment creates vulnerability. The more people reshape their surroundings, the more their future depends on the systems they have created. This is one reason the rise of farming should not be narrated as simple progress. It is not a clean ascent from hardship to comfort. Early farmers often work harder than many foragers. Their diets can become narrower. Living close to animals and one another can increase disease risks. Stored food can attract pests and conflict. Settlement can intensify social pressure. Yet agriculture also supports larger populations, more permanent houses, surplus storage, craft specialization, inherited land claims, and eventually institutions that grow too large for memory alone. It is a bargain with deep rewards and deep costs. No single explanation fully accounts for why this bargain was accepted in different places. But once communities move far enough into it, turning back becomes difficult. The world before Sumer is therefore not simply discovering farming, it is discovering dependence. Dependence on particular plants, dependence on certain water sources, dependence on neighbours, dependence on stored food, dependence on seasonal labour, dependence on places whose meanings have been built over generations. This dependence is not weakness. It is the beginning of social density. But it is also the beginning of new forms of risk. A bad harvest can matter more when many people rely on one crop. A damaged canal in later Mesopotamia will matter more than a dry patch of wild grass. A conflict between households can become harder to escape when houses, fields, burials, and obligations bind people to the same ground. In this sense, the early Neolithic creates the emotional and practical grammar of later civilization. Work becomes scheduled by season, food becomes stored against the future, architecture becomes inherited, community projects become possible. Ritual spaces gather people beyond household scale. Ornaments, burials, and symbols mark identity. The landscape itself becomes an artifact, shaped by walls, fields, paths, traps, houses, and memory. Sumer will later magnify these forces through irrigation, administration, writing, temple economies, and city life. But the forces are older. They are already present wherever people coordinate action around a shared place. On the open ground of Şanlıurfa, where lines of stone may once have helped direct animal movement, and on the limestone heights where pillars stare across time, and in the dense rooms of settlements where smoke darkens plastered walls, the same transformation is underway. Human life is becoming heavier, more connected, more organized, more difficult to leave behind. The great discovery before Sumer is not only that people built earlier than expected, it is that they learned to bind themselves together before the city existed, and once that binding became strong enough, history began to gather weight. The more people bind themselves to place, the more the living world around them begins to change. At first, the changes are almost invisible. A patch of wild grain near a settlement grows thicker because people return to it. Seeds fall near houses, in disturbed soil where human activity has cleared competitors. Animals become familiar not only as moving prey, but as repeated presences in nearby valleys, slopes, and seasonal routes. Dogs, already part of human life in some regions by this time, blur the boundary between wild companion and managed animal. Then, across many generations, a deeper transformation begins. Plants and animals do not merely feed people. They begin to evolve in response to human habits. This is domestication, and it is one of the strangest bargains in history. Domestication is often imagined as a moment of capture, as if someone simply chooses a wild plant or animal and turns it into property. The reality is slower and more intimate. Wild wheat and barley become domestic not because one person invents farming, but because human harvesting and sowing favor certain traits again and again. In wild cereals, ripe seeds often break away easily and scatter. That is useful for the plant in nature, but inconvenient for people who want to gather a harvest. Plants whose seed heads hold together a little longer are easier to collect, and if people gather, store, and sow those seeds, the trait becomes more common over generations. The plant becomes dependent on human action. It loses some of its old wild efficiency in exchange for a place inside human life. A domestic grain field is therefore not just food. It is an evolutionary partnership, though not an equal one. The same is true, in different ways, for animals. Goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs do not all enter human life at the same pace or in the same manner. Their domestication histories are complex, regionally varied, and still debated in detail. Archaeologists look for shifts in age and sex patterns in bones, changes in body size, horn shape, settlement context, dung deposits, enclosure evidence, and genetic signals. None of these clues is perfect on its own. A hunted population can sometimes mimic parts of a managed profile. A managed herd may still look physically wild in early phases. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still refine the timelines. But gradually, the pattern becomes clear. In parts of Southwest Asia, people begin not only to hunt animals, but to manage their reproduction, movement, and survival. They become involved in the future of the herd. This changes the emotional structure of daily life. A wild gazelle herd passes through a landscape and is encountered when conditions allow. A managed sheep or goat herd must be watched, moved, protected, bred, milked in later developments, and integrated into the rhythm of settlement. Animals become wealth before coins exist. They become risk that breathes. They turn grass, shrubs, and marginal land into meat, milk, fibre, hides, bone, horn, and social value. But they also demand labour and create vulnerability. Disease can move between animals and people. Herd loss can damage a household's future. Access to pasture and water can become a source of negotiation. A community that manages animals is not simply more secure than one that hunts. It is secure in a different way and exposed in a different way. The plants bring their own pressures. Farming ties people to the calendar with a force that foraging often does not. A field must be prepared before it rewards anyone. Seeds must be set aside instead of eaten. Harvest must happen at the right time. Stored grain must be guarded against moisture, pests, and theft. Grinding grain is daily labour, slow and repetitive, wearing on hands, knees, backs, and teeth. The polished romance of early agriculture hides this physical cost. The first farmers are not stepping into ease, they're stepping into a world of planning, waiting, and dependence. Yet the reward is powerful, more predictable food in some conditions. The possibility of feeding larger communities, the ability to remain in place, and the accumulation of stores that can carry people through leaner months. This is where the path towards civilization grows heavier. Storage changes society because stored food is time-made material. A basket of grain is not only a meal, it is tomorrow, next month, an obligation, a debt, a feast, a seed reserve, a bargaining tool, a temptation, and eventually a taxable unit. Once food can be accumulated, questions follow. Who owns it? Who guards it? Who distributes it? Who receives it during shortage? Which household has more? Which lineage controls the best fields? Which ritual gathering consumes surplus? And who gains prestige by providing it? The Neolithic village may not yet have the bureaucracy of Uruk, but the social questions that bureaucracy will later formalize are already forming around stored life. The spread of farming is not a single wave washing evenly across the world. It moves through adoption, migration, exchange, imitation, resistance, and local adaptation. Some communities take up crops and animals quickly. Others blend farming with hunting, fishing, and gathering for long periods. Some reject or delay the full agricultural bargain because their landscapes still provide rich alternatives. This is important because it prevents the old story from becoming too mechanical. Agriculture is not destiny. It is a set of practices that becomes attractive under certain ecological and social conditions, and costly under others. What survives in the record suggests many experiments, not one universal revolution. Yet where the system deepens, the human footprint expands. Fields alter vegetation, herds change grazing patterns, trees are cut for fuel and construction, paths become more fixed, villages draw people, animals, insects, refuse, smoke, and memory into tighter zones. The landscape near a settlement becomes increasingly human-made, not artificial in the modern sense, but shaped by repeated choices. The wild is still close. Wolves, boars, wild cattle, snakes, birds, and storms remain part of life. But the balance begins to shift. People are no longer only reading the land, they are editing it. The lesser-known irony is that domesticated species also reshape people. Human bodies adapt culturally and sometimes biologically to new diets. Teeth record grit from ground grain. Bones can reflect changes in work. Settlement exposes populations to different disease environments. Social life becomes denser, more scheduled, more inherited. The house, the field, the herd, the storage bin, and the ancestor beneath the floor all begin to hold the individual inside a web of obligations. Freedom does not disappear, but it is reorganized. Movement becomes more costly when so much of life is invested in a fixed place. By the time the full Neolithic world spreads across Western Asia, the ingredients of later civilization are no longer rare. There are villages, crops, herds, craft traditions, long-distance exchange, ritual buildings, ancestor practices, communal labor, and stored surplus. Still, there are no Sumerian city-states yet. No clay tablets list barley accounts. No priestly households administer vast estates in writing. No urban crowd presses through streets under the shadow of monumental temple platforms. The next transformation will require not merely farming, but scale larger settlements, irrigation, specialization, inequality, trade, and new forms of authority. But that future depends on the older bargain made with plants and animals. A wild grain becomes a crop and loses the easy freedom to scatter itself. A wild animal becomes a herd and survives through human management. Humans gain food, numbers, permanence, and power, while also accepting labor, risk, and dependency. Before Sumer can rise from the southern mud, before Uruk can swell into one of the world's first true cities, people must first learn to live inside systems they themselves have created. That is the quiet revolution beneath the louder one. Civilization begins not when humans conquer nature, but when humans and nature become locked together so tightly that neither can follow the old path alone. The bargain with plants and animals does not immediately create Sumer. For thousands of years after the first farming villages take root, the great alluvial south of Mesopotamia remains only one part of a much wider world of experiments. The older highland and foothill zones, with their rainfall farming, stone sources, woodlands, springs, and visible archaeological mounds, often seem easier to understand. They give up their houses, tools, burials, and monuments with a certain clarity. Southern Mesopotamia is different. It is a low, shifting, watery landscape made by rivers that never stop rearranging the ground beneath human feet. The Tigris and Euphrates carry silt from distant mountains, lay it across plains, split into branches, abandon channels, create marshes, flood basins, levees, and islands of dry land that appear and disappear through time. The very landscape that will one day nourish cities is also a landscape that hides its earliest history. To modern eyes, the southern plain can seem like the obvious place for civilization to arise, because the rivers are famous and the later cities are famous: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish. But early farmers do not walk into an empty paradise. Rainfall is limited, summers are harsh, stone is scarce, good timber is scarce, metal ores are absent. The land can be extraordinarily productive, but only if water is managed carefully. Too little water means failure. Too much water means flooding, salinity, ruined fields, and channels that shift beyond control. This is not a landscape that gives civilization freely. It must be negotiated, engineered, endured, and remembered. That scarcity may have been one of its hidden engines. In the north and in Anatolia, communities can build with stone, draw on nearby wood, and use diverse upland ecologies. In the southern alluvium, people build with mud, reed, clay, bitumen, and ingenuity. Reeds become architecture, matting, boats, baskets, fences, roofs, tools, and fuel. Mud becomes brick, wall, platform, bowl, seal impression, and eventually tablet. Clay is humble until it becomes the memory of the world. The lack of stone does not prevent complexity. It pushes people toward materials that are everywhere, flexible, and perishable. This creates a strange archaeological imbalance. Much of the earlier southern life may have been built from things that decay, collapse, dissolve, or are buried under later silt. What survives in the record is only part of what existed. The marshes are especially important. Later written and artistic traditions from Mesopotamia show marsh worlds full of reeds, fish, birds, boats, and water buffalo in much later periods. But long before writing, the wetland ecology of the south must have offered rich possibilities. Fish, waterfowl, reeds, wild plants, and river transport could support human life alongside cultivation. The first southern communities are not simply dryland grain farmers waiting to become urban. They live in a mixed world of water and mud, where movement by boat may have mattered as much as movement by foot. Scholars still debate the precise shape of early settlement in the alluvium, partly because ancient river courses are difficult to reconstruct and early sites may be deeply buried or destroyed. But the environmental logic is clear. Southern Mesopotamia is not just a plain. It is a water machine. Irrigation begins as a practical answer to that machine. At first, it need not be grand. A small channel, a diverted flow, a field placed along a natural levee, a bund to hold water, a cut to drain excess, a schedule agreed between neighbours. These are modest acts, yet they create social consequences. Water must arrive at the right time. Channels must be cleared. Fields downstream depend on decisions upstream. Neglect in one place can damage another. A farming system based on rainfall can still demand cooperation, but irrigation intensifies the need for coordination because water moves through shared space. It carries not only fertility, but conflict. It requires agreements, authority, memory, and eventually records. This is one of the deepest bridges from the Neolithic village to the city. A village can remember many things orally: who planted which field, who helped repair a house, who contributed food to a feast, who owes whom labour. But as settlements grow and irrigation networks expand, memory comes under pressure. Obligations multiply. Harvests vary. Labour must be summoned for channel maintenance. Surplus must be collected, stored, redistributed, and protected. Specialised crafts become easier when some people can be fed by the production of others. Trade becomes necessary when a region lacks stone, timber, and metals. The southern plains' poverty in certain raw materials helps pull it outward into exchange networks. Boats, donkeys in later contexts, river routes, and overland contacts link the alluvium with mountains, deserts, and distant sources of valuable goods. Before Uruk becomes a giant, the Ubaid period begins to show a more connected Mesopotamian world. Settlements share certain ceramic styles, architectural forms, and cultural practices across a wide region. Sites such as Eridu gain special importance in later memory. and early temples or temple-like buildings suggest that communal and ritual institutions are becoming more formal. The details remain debated, and it is dangerous to read later Sumerian religion backward too confidently into earlier levels. Still, a pattern emerges: larger settlements, public buildings, expanding exchange, craft traditions, and social differences that are more visible than in many earlier villages. The house is still important, but it is no longer the only container of community meaning. Public institutions begin to take architectural shape. This does not mean that the city is inevitable. Many early complex settlements across the world rise, change, shrink, or vanish without becoming states. The southern Mesopotamian path is one among several possible futures, but in this region, a distinctive combination gathers: force irrigation agriculture, wetland abundance, mud brick architecture, temple-centered communal life, long-distance exchange, population growth, craft specialization, and the need to organize labor across unstable water systems. Each element has older roots. None alone creates civilization. Together, over time, they produce a new kind of pressure. The lesser-known transformation is the rise of administrative habits before full writing. People begin using tokens, sealings, stamp seals, accounting devices, and marked containers to manage goods and obligations. A seal impression on clay is a small thing, but it changes trust. It says that a container was closed by a recognized person or institution. It creates a material witness. Before signs become writing, clay is already being used to make memory external. This is the quiet prehistory of the tablet. The earliest writing will not begin as poetry or history. It will begin largely in administration, in the need to count, control, and remember things that society can no longer hold only in speech. The long road from Ohalo II to Sumer therefore narrows as it enters the southern plain. Wild seeds on grinding stones become domesticated grain in fields. Seasonal return becomes inherited settlement. Communal gathering becomes public architecture. Ornaments and symbolic bodies become seals and signs. Shared labor becomes irrigation maintenance and institutional authority. Stored food becomes surplus, ration, and account. The transformation is not morally simple. It brings population growth, invention, art, and astonishing coordination, but also hierarchy, dependence, inequality, and new forms of control. Civilization is not merely humanity becoming more advanced. It is humanity becoming more entangled with its own systems. In the southern mud, the final pieces begin to settle into place. The rivers flood and withdraw. Reeds whisper in the marshes. Farmers watch channels. Builders stack sun-dried bricks. Potters fire vessels. Traders carry materials from places the plain cannot supply. Somewhere, someone presses a seal into wet clay, not to create literature, not to announce the birth of history, but to solve a practical problem of memory, and in that small pressure of carved surface against clay, the world before Sumer approaches the edge of writing. At Uruk, the long experiment finally crosses a threshold that feels unmistakably different. The settlement does not merely grow larger, it becomes a new kind of organism, one in which people, buildings, fields, workshops, canals, temples, storerooms, seals, and clay records begin to operate together at a scale earlier communities had approached but not yet transformed into urban life. The city is not born in a single instant. It expands through centuries of pressure and adaptation, through mud brick construction, administrative innovation, agricultural surplus, and the gathering of people who may no longer know every face around them. That is one of the profound changes of the city. A village can still live inside memory. A city must invent systems to remember for it. The southern Mesopotamian plain helps make this possible, but it also makes it necessary. Irrigated fields can produce impressive yields when water is controlled, but they require coordination beyond the household. Canals need maintenance, harvest needs storage, labour needs timing, livestock, grain, wool, fish, dates, reeds, and craft goods move through a landscape where abundance depends on management. As Uruk grows, the old oral world does not vanish, but it becomes insufficient. Too many goods move through too many hands. Too many obligations stretch across too many people. The city begins to need marks that can outlast a conversation. Clay, once just the mud beneath human feet, becomes a technology of trust. The earliest writing that emerges in this world is not primarily the voice of kings telling heroic stories. It is more practical and, in a way, more revealing. It counts, it lists, it tracks commodities, labour, containers, animals, and allocations. It grows from earlier administrative tools, from tokens, sealings, impressed clay, and the habit of making economic relationships visible in material form. A temple or institutional household that receives stores and redistributes goods cannot rely only on someone's memory. A mark in clay can remember what a person might forget, and because the mark can be shown to others, it can also settle disputes, enforce obligations, and create authority. Writing begins as memory made portable and durable. Only later does it become literature, royal inscription, myth, law, and the long echo by which ancient people speak across millennia. This is the moment where Sumer seems to justify its reputation as a beginning. In Uruk and related southern centres, the features often associated with civilization gather with unusual density urban scale, monumental architecture, craft specialization, complex administration, long-distance exchange, social hierarchy, and the earliest writing. The city's great precincts rise in mud brick, repeatedly rebuilt and enlarged. Temples or temple-like institutions become focal points of economic and symbolic power. Workers produce standardized goods. Cylinder seals roll images across clay, creating miniature worlds of identity, ownership, and institutional control. Bowls, jars, tablets, ceilings, and architectural remains reveal a society increasingly organized through quantities, categories, and offices. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how political authority worked in early Uruk, how centralized its institutions were, and how the city's influence spread. But the scale of the transformation is clear enough. Human life has entered a new administrative atmosphere. Yet the deeper story should prevent us from mistaking Uruk for a miracle without ancestors. The city is startling not because nothing came before it, but because so much came before it and was reorganized there. The wild grains processed at Ohalo, too, are not the same as the barley rations of Uruk, but they belong to the deep history of human attention to seeds. The gathering places of Taş Tepeler are not temples in the Sumerian sense, but they show the power of shared architecture and symbolic labour. Jericho's tower is not a ziggurat, but it proves that communities could build beyond household need thousands of years earlier. Çatalhöyük is not a city-state, but its dense domestic life shows how humans learn to live inside layered architecture and memory. The Neolithic body ornaments are not cylinder seals, but they belong to the longer history of identity made visible. The city takes all these older capacities and changes their scale. Scale is not a minor detail. When a settlement grows beyond the limits of intimate recognition, social life becomes abstract. People are no longer bound only by kinship, face-to-face trust, and shared memory. They are bound by institutions, roles, measures, stored goods, work groups, ritual obligations, and eventually written records. A person may become visible to the system not as a neighbour, but as a worker, a recipient of rations, a specialist, a dependent, a contributor, a name or sign attached to a quantity. This does not mean city life is cold or without personal bonds. Families, friendships, households, and local loyalties continue. But above them grows something larger, a framework that can coordinate thousands of lives without every person knowing every other person. That framework is civilization's strength, and also its danger. The city can do what smaller communities cannot. It can support specialists who spend their lives not farming directly, but weaving, carving, brewing, building, trading, administering, serving institutions, or shaping objects for exchange and ritual. It can gather materials from far away because it produces goods and surplus worth moving. It can create monuments that embody collective power. It can preserve records across generations. It can turn a local settlement into a regional force. But the city also concentrates inequality. Some people command, others carry, some store, others receive. Some signs authorize movement, others are bound by them. A clay tablet can remember fairly, but it can also control. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of hierarchy in early Mesopotamia. But once administration becomes embedded in daily life, power gains a new material body. One of the lesser-known wonders of Uruk is how much of this world remains anonymous. The city stands near the beginning of writing, yet most of its earliest records do not give us personal stories in the way modern audiences might hope. They are not diaries from the first urban dwellers. They are accounts, signs, lists, systems. They reveal a society thinking administratively before it tells us how individuals felt about living inside it. That silence is powerful. We can see the machinery of the first city before we can hear its private voices. We can count what it counted, but we cannot easily know what it was like to wake in its crowded districts, smell reed smoke and wet clay, hear animals and workers near a canal, or stand before a rising temple platform and feel the city's weight. Still, through the mud, brick and clay, something human comes through. Uruk is made by hands. Every brick is shaped, dried, carried, and placed. Every channel must be cut and cleared. Every tablet is pressed by fingers into wet clay. Every seal is rolled by a person who trusts that the image means something recognized by others. Civilization can appear abstract when viewed from above, but at ground level it is still bodies working with earth, water, plants, animals, and memory. The difference is that now those bodies are woven into institutions large enough to outlive them. This is why the discovery before Sumer does not diminish Sumer. It makes Sumer more extraordinary. The first city is not a sudden spark in darkness. It is a convergence after an immense human dawn. Behind Uruk stands the Ice Age camp, the wild seed, the grinding stone, the ritual hill, the spring-fed tower, the crowded house, the ornamented body, the managed herd, the canal bank, the seal impression. The city gathers these old threads and tightens them into a new fabric. From that fabric comes history in the written sense. But the cloth itself was spun long before the first sign dried in clay. By the time Uruk stands on the southern plain, it becomes tempting to let the city pull the entire story toward itself, as if every earlier camp, village, tower, enclosure, and painted house was only a step on the way to Sumer. But that is not how the past works. The people at Ohalo too were not trying to invent agriculture. The builders at Göbeklitepe were not rehearsing for temple bureaucracy. The households of Çatalhöyük were not failed urban planners because they did not produce streets, palaces, or writing. Jericho's tower was not an unfinished ziggurat. Each world made sense within its own conditions, needs, dangers, memories, and possibilities. The discovery that could rewrite civilization is not the revelation of one hidden superculture before Sumer. It is the recognition that human complexity is older, broader, and stranger than the old timeline allowed. That recognition is difficult because the word civilization carries a heavy inheritance. It tends to favor what survives impressively: cities, walls, kings, writing, armies, monuments, and treasure. It rewards societies that leave behind records legible to states, museums, and textbooks. A clay tablet listing barley can seem more historical than a grinding stone worn smooth by thousands of movements. A palace wall can seem more advanced than a brush hut. A king's name can seem more important than an unnamed community that learned to live with the spring for centuries. Yet the older evidence forces a different kind of respect. It shows that the foundations of later civilization were not invented all at once by the first states. They were assembled from much older human capacities: memory, cooperation, food knowledge, symbolic imagination, placemaking, exchange, and the ability to bind people together around shared tasks. Still, the evidence must be handled carefully. The deep past is vulnerable to exaggeration. It is easy to turn every early structure into a temple, every symbol into a lost language, every old settlement into a forgotten civilization, every mystery into proof that accepted history is wrong. Popular theories often rush into the spaces where evidence is thin, offering a clean answer where archaeology gives a difficult one. But the real story is more powerful precisely because it does not need those shortcuts. There is no need to invent an Ice Age empire to make Ohalo too important. There is no need to claim that Göbeklitepe was built by a vanished advanced civilization to make its pillars astonishing. There is no need to force Çatalhöyük into the shape of a city to understand its complexity. What survives in the record is already enough to challenge the old assumptions, if we allow it to speak in its own language. The challenge is that this language is fragmentary. Archaeologists work with burned seeds, microscopic wear marks, soil stains, animal bones, post holes, phytoliths, pollen, isotopes, DNA when it survives, chipped stone, plaster layers, burial positions, collapsed walls, and the distribution of objects across floors. From these traces, they reconstruct behavior cautiously, knowing that many materials are missing forever. Wood rots, textiles vanish, songs disappear, spoken names evaporate. Myths leave no shadow unless they are carved, painted, buried, or later written down. The silence is immense. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate many of the most important questions: how sedentary early communities really were, what the Taş Tepeler enclosures meant, how quickly cultivation became domestication, why some settlements grew while others did not, and how social inequality first hardened into institutional power. This uncertainty should not make the story feel weaker. It should make it feel more alive. A mystery grounded in evidence is different from a mystery built from fantasy. It does not claim more than it can know. It follows clues until they fade, then marks the darkness honestly. And the darkness here is vast. We do not know what languages were spoken in the pre-Sumerian Neolithic communities of Anatolia and the Levant. We do not know what stories were told before the carved reliefs at Seybert. We do not know what names people gave to the animals on the pillars, or whether those animals were feared, honoured, remembered, mocked, or transformed into beings far beyond ordinary zoology. We do not know how a child growing safely within a Neolithic household understood the ancestors beneath the floor, or how elders explained the rebuilding of a house over older walls. We do not know whether the builders of Göbeklitepe saw their work as obligation, celebration, fear, devotion, politics, or something for which modern languages have no exact word. Yet the patterns are real. Across thousands of years, people become increasingly tied to places. They gather wild plants, then cultivate. They hunt wild animals, then manage herds. They build temporary shelters, then lasting houses, then communal structures, then dense settlements, then cities. They mark bodies, then objects, then containers, then clay tablets. They remember through landscape, then architecture, then images, then writing. The sequence is not universal and not smooth, but the broad movement in Western Asia is visible. The old line between prehistory and history begins to look less like a wall and more like a shoreline, advancing and retreating over a landscape already full of human meaning. The deeper shadow beneath Sumer is therefore not a single missing chapter. It is an entire library that burned before writing existed. Most of its pages were never made from anything durable enough to survive. They were carried in voices, gestures, seasonal routines, craft techniques, kinship obligations, songs, stories, and paths through the land. When writing finally appears, it captures only a narrow part of the human world at first, mostly the part that institutions need to control. It does not record everything people know. It records what early administration must remember. That is why the beginning of written history is also a kind of distortion. It lets us see the state more clearly than the household, the ration more clearly than the meal, the institution more clearly than the feeling of belonging to a place. To look before Sumer is to restore some balance. It reminds us that human history is not only the history of rulers and cities, it is also the history of anonymous intelligence. The person who learns to grind wild seeds efficiently changes the future, even if no one records their name. The group that returns to a lakeshore and builds brush huts in a favoured place participates in the long making of settled memory. The community that raises a stone pillar without metal tools proves that shared belief can move matter. The household that replasters a wall and buries its dead beneath the floor creates continuity without a written genealogy. The people who carve animals, wear ornaments, manage herds, dig channels, seal jars, and stack mud bricks are all part of the same long human experiment. So the discovery that could rewrite civilization is not a single object pulled from the ground. It is a change in perspective. It is the realization that Sumer marks a threshold, not an origin point. The city brings writing, scale, administration, and a new kind of historical visibility, but it stands on older ground. Beneath the first tablets lies the unwritten patience of tens of thousands of years. Beneath the first temples lie hills where people gathered around stones and animals. Beneath the first grain accounts lie wild seeds collected by Ice Age hands. Beneath the first urban walls lies the older human desire to make a place last. And once that is understood, the timeline of civilization no longer looks like a sudden sunrise over Mesopotamia. It looks like a long horizon slowly brightening, with fires already burning in the dark long before anyone writes down the name of the dawn. The ground still keeps more than it gives. That is the final lesson of the world before Sumer. Every discovery feels like a door opening, but beyond it there is always another wall of silence. A lakeshore camp appears beneath the mud and shows that Ice Age people were processing plants, building shelters, fishing, returning, and organizing life around a place thousands of years before farming. A hilltop in southeastern Anatolia reveals carved pillars and communal spaces where the old boundary between hunter-gatherer and settled farmer breaks down. A spring-fed settlement at Jericho raises a tower before cities exist. A crowded mound at Çatalhöyük fills houses with burials, paintings, plaster, memory, and smoke. The southern Mesopotamian plain gathers water, mud, grain, reeds, labour, seals, and clay into the first urban systems. Yet none of these discoveries closes the story. Each one widens it. There are still missing settlements under silt, under modern towns, under lake deposits, under fields, under dunes, and under the sea. Since Ice Age sea levels were far lower, many coastlines where people once lived now lie drowned beneath modern waters. Whole landscapes of movement, fishing, gathering, and settlement may be gone from ordinary archaeology, not because they never existed, but because the ocean reclaimed them before history began. This matters deeply. The visible record is not the whole record. It is only the part that survived erosion, burial, excavation, preservation, and attention. What seems rare may sometimes be rare only because the earth has hidden most examples. What seems sudden may be sudden only because earlier stages have disappeared. This is why every new find in the Neolithic world changes more than a local map. A carved relief at Saburs does not merely add one image to a museum catalogue, it suggests narrative imagination in stone before writing. Finds at Tepe do not merely expand a site list. They show that Göbeklitepe belongs to a wider cultural landscape. Ornaments at Bonkuklu do not merely decorate the past, they reveal bodies as social surfaces. Evidence of large-scale hunting systems does not merely explain food, it suggests coordinated labour across land before states. Ohalo too does not merely add an old camp, it pushes plant processing and place-based behaviour deeper into the Ice Age. Each discovery is small beside the missing whole, but together they make the old origin story too narrow to hold. The mystery is not that civilization had a secret advanced predecessor in 20,000 BC. The evidence does not support that. The mystery is more subtle and more human. Why did so many of the capacities associated with civilization appear in scattered, partial, experimental forms long before cities? Why did some communities settle while others continued to move? Why did some build monuments before full agriculture, while others farmed without becoming urban? Why did symbolic life become so intense in certain landscapes? Why did the southern Mesopotamian plain, with its difficult water and limited raw materials, eventually become the place where writing and cities transformed the human record? Scholars still debate these questions, and no single explanation fully accounts for the sequence: climate, resources, population, belief, competition, cooperation, trade, technology, and chance all play their parts, but none can stand alone. Perhaps the most important answer is that civilization is not a thing invented once. It is an accumulation of solutions to older problems. How does a group remember? How does it store food? How does it organize labor? How does it mark identity? How does it return to a place and make that return meaningful? How does it live with ancestors, animals, seasons, neighbors, scarcity, abundance, and risk? The first cities answer these questions in one powerful way, with institutions, walls, temples, accounts, offices, and writing. But earlier communities have been answering them differently for thousands of years. Their answers were made of brush huts, hearths, grinding stones, plastered floors, carved animals, ornaments, towers, burials, paths, and repeated acts of return. The great difference is visibility. Sumer becomes visible because it writes. Once writing appears, history gains a new kind of memory, but it also becomes biased toward what writing records. It remembers grain owed to an institution more easily than a story told around a hearth. It remembers a seal impression more clearly than a gesture of welcome. It remembers the work of administration better than the private texture of daily life. Before writing, human beings were not without history. They were without a durable system that allowed their words to cross millennia. Archaeology must listen to what remains after speech is gone. And what remains is enough to be humbling. The first cities did not rise above a primitive world. They rose above an ancient, skillful, experimental human landscape already filled with memory and invention. By the time a scribe at Uruk pressed signs into clay, people had been shaping environments for tens of thousands of years. They had learned plants, animals, stone, fire, water, shelter, bodies, symbols, and place. They had built communities that did not become cities, and yet were not failures. They were other answers to being human. So the world before Sumer remains unfinished in the most compelling way. It is not a lost civilization waiting to be named. It is a long human dawn, uneven and half-hidden, where the future appears in fragments before it becomes recognizable. A seed in ash, a pillar in limestone, a tower near a spring, a painted wall under a roof, a seal pressed into clay. Each fragment is real, but none is the whole. The earth still holds the missing pieces, and some of them may never return. Still, enough has returned to change the question. We no longer have to ask whether anything important happened before Sumer. The answer is everywhere. It happened beside Ice Age lakes, on Anatolian hills, near desert springs, inside crowded houses, along river channels, in fields, in marshes, in bodies marked with ornaments, and in landscapes where people slowly learned that a place could hold memory. Sumer did not begin the human story of civilization. It gave that story a new form, a written surface and a city's shadow. But the deeper story was already there, waiting under mud, stone, plaster, ash, and time. The long road now grows quiet. The fires at Ohalo too have gone cold. The pillars of Göbeklitepe stand without their builders. Jericho's tower rises in silence from a world that no longer speaks its language. The roofs of Çatalhöyük have collapsed into the mound that preserved them. The first tablets of Uruk have dried into clay hard enough to outlive the voices that made them necessary. What remains is not certainty, but presence. A sense that human beings were always more than the labels later ages gave them. Hunter, gatherer, farmer, villager, builder, scribe, citizen. These names help us sort the past, but they cannot contain it. People lived before the categories. They watched weather change. They learned the patience of seeds. They made shelters from reeds and houses from mud. They returned to places because memory pulled them back. They carved animals into stone because the animal world mattered in ways we can only partly imagine. They buried their dead close to home, carried ornaments against the skin, stored food against hunger, and slowly built systems that would one day grow larger than anyone could fully control. Civilization seen from this distance is not a triumph standing apart from nature. It is a fragile arrangement between water, grain, labor, memory, belief, and time. It can build cities, but it can also bury them. It can write names, but it cannot save every voice. It can leave monuments, but it cannot prevent meaning from fading. The deeper past reminds us that disappearance is not the exception. It is the rule. Most human lives leave almost nothing behind, and yet every generation adds something to the ground beneath the next. Before Sumer, before writing, before kings, before the first city learned to count itself, there were already people making worlds. Their worlds were smaller in scale, but not smaller in humanity. They did not know they were preparing a future. They were only living, returning, building, remembering, adapting, and leaving traces. And somewhere beneath the surface, in places not yet excavated, other traces remain. A floor under silt, a hearth under water, a tool beside a vanished shoreline, a seed darkened by fire. The past does not give itself all at once. It waits, patient and incomplete, like a buried light beneath the earth.